We'll close the session with a talk by Divya Siddarth, Executive Director and co-founder of the Collective Intelligence Project, which works to democratize artificial intelligence. CIP has worked with partners such as the Taiwanese Digital Ministry, the UK Frontier AI Task Force, OpenAI, Anthropic, Mistral, and Creative Commons to apply new governance models to AI. For this work, Divya Siddarth was named one of 2024's Time 100 Most Influential People in AI. Her talk is titled Building Collective Intelligence with Artificial Intelligence. We turn to you.
I love when people clap and you haven't even done anything yet. This is great. Thanks, guys. So as mentioned, I think I have slides, by the way, if anyone wants to throw those up. But as mentioned, I am Divya. I started an organization called the Collective Intelligence Project a few years ago, and we work on democratic inputs into building collectively intelligent AI systems. That is a lot of value-laden words, and I know we have a bunch of philosophers in the room, but this is a 15-minute talk, so I'm just going to get directly into it instead of discussing those things. So what I want to argue today is basically that we need ambitious medium-term projects now to figure out how to democratize the AI ecosystem. And I'll do that by sharing some learnings from attempting this and some recommendations for paths forward. So here's what I mean by democratization. I think a more democratic AI ecosystem would have, more democratic uses of AI, so basic digital divide kinds of questions people around the world, as we've been discussing, should be able to use and access and understand these systems. Second, democratization of development also came up a lot in our panel just now, and different kinds of people should be involved in developing these systems, right? We talked about gender, we talked about global equity. We need people from around the world, different kinds of people to be involved in development. But that is not enough. I know there have been conversations throughout the day about democratizing governance. Who gets to decide what happens? Who gets to decide when systems get deployed? What applications are worth building? What's getting funded? Those are questions that go beyond development. Who gets to decide if we need to shut things down or slow things down? So those questions are around governance. And finally, around benefits. So even if we have democratic governance of some kind, it's no guarantee that different kinds of people will actually benefit from the technology. People contributing data will benefit from the tech, right? Different kinds of people will actually benefit from the few very powerful companies we're seeing in this space. So this is what I mean by democratization. It's not the perfect definition, but I think it's good enough to keep going. The reality is pretty far from this, right? We're seeing a lot of concentration of productive resources in this space. A few organizations and countries have a meaningful percentage of the power here. And, as is unsurprising, a meaningful under-provision of public goods. What does that mean? Public AI models, public infrastructure for compute, public data sets, all of these kinds of things are systematically under-provided, as public goods often are, because we don't have institutions to step in and solve those problems. The upshot of this is that I would say AI is outpacing collective intelligence. Without getting too into what collective intelligence is, it's how we prioritize and make decisions as groups, right? And we are doing a much worse job of doing that in the public interest than we are at building really transformative technology, which is a very bad combination. Why is this so difficult? There are many reasons why democracy is difficult. There are many reasons why democratization is difficult. I will not get into all of them. But the three that we have faced as an organization trying to solve this problem are scope, feasibility, and leverage. Scope is something we were just talking about. Who is involved when we say democracy? Are we trying to make one global decision for the entire world? We all feel like that's pretty unfeasible, right? Are we trying to make tons of small local decisions? This is a pretty tough way to govern a transformative technology. Should we talk to the people who are most affected? Should we talk to the people who are nearby? Should we talk to the people who already know how to use the tech? There are many ways to try to find an audience for democratization, and in basically arguing over who should be involved, we often never do anything. So scope is a big problem. The second is feasibility, which can be technical feasibility. So how are you actually building this input into systems? It could be infrastructure feasibility, who's paying for it, on whose compute, with whose data. There are a bunch of questions around feasibility that prevent us from building useful democratic AI. And the third, and it might be the biggest, is leverage, right? How do you make anyone do anything? We have an ecosystem that exists. It's a pretty decentralized ecosystem in a lot of ways, in that there are many meaningful actors in it. Even if a lot of the money is in a few places, there are still a lot of people to convince, and a lot of those people are hard to convince, and they might not care about these things up front, or you might have to show why this matters. And so these are the three major reasons that we've come up against. And I put them out here not because I think this is like a life-changing framework, but rather I'd like us to actually experiment with what it looks like to just pick a set of answers on these questions and run experiments. I think our space, or at least I will say my space, often underdoes experimentation and tries to find the right answers to these questions. We don't know what those are. We're probably not going to know what they are. So what does it look like to choose a scope, to find a way to make that scope feasible, and to try to build specific points of leverage around how to make that project happen, which I know a bunch of people in this room do. I will walk through briefly some of our experience in doing this in order to kind of pull out the questions that I'm currently struggling with in hopes that people here will be interested in working on those, maybe are already working on those, or will want to collaborate. So we started in thinking about our leverage point as working with AI labs to build democratic input into their models. So we started out working with labs like OpenAI and Anthropic to build public input from Americans, which was the most convenient population at the time. So small scope, very specific feasibility, right? How do you actually build public input into the Constitution that Claude is trained on, into the evaluations that OpenAI runs? And the leverage was that we convinced those organizations that this was going to be useful for the technology they were building. So this is one set of answers to those questions, right? Scope to one country, feasibility to direct technical architecture, leverage through those people. That was useful projects. We showed that the public input models actually performed better than the base models. Some of those principles are now in production in Claude. This was a useful thing to do, and we're still doing some of that work. But that's not everything. We can't directly hold these companies to account. This was still a very American project. It's still focused on model architecture, right? And so then we spent some time with governments. We spent time at the UK AI Safety Institute, in the Digital Ministry, in Taiwan. Very different scope. When you're working with a government, you have to think about that country, right? Fundamentally, their incentives are to help the people of that country. So your scope is kind of set for you. Your feasibility is actually, in a lot of ways, a lot harder. I'm sure you all have much more experience working with governments than I did as a researcher coming from Silicon Valley, but it's slow. And so the scope and feasibility was different for governments, but the leverage was a bit easier in some ways because they already had public interest mandates, right? So it makes sense why these processes would work in government. That's another way to do it. I think we need many more examples of functional public input working in public systems, particularly as a lot of world governments think more about AI. After that, we were thinking about local partners. I mean, local partners have a much smaller scope, but many of them are very interested in participating in these processes. So we turned away from these big institutions like big AI labs and governments and spent some time working with communities. We built a product called Community Models, and this allows any community in the world to kind of run the process we ran with Anthropic in the sense that they can articulate their values and get a fine-tuned model, open source or not, trained on those values. And so we wanted to open up the process that we were running to anyone who wanted to run it. This has a much smaller scope. It's very feasible because we're building all of it internally. And the leverage is at much lower, right? So you're helping small groups of people. This is a useful thing to do, but it doesn't necessarily change the entire ecosystem. And finally, we're now working on global input processes, which is why I'm lucky enough to be after our global input panel. And these processes look at people from around the world and ask people from around the world questions on how they want to see the future of AI, the kinds of things they want to benchmark on, the kinds of things they want to evaluate, to our questions about all the stuff that red teaming misses, right? The kinds of things that they find as difficult in running the projects they're already running, and the futures they want to see, the questions that they're worried about asking. So this moves us to a very large scope. We're trying to ask some representative sample, and I'm happy to talk about how we do that, of people around the world. The feasibility is easier because we're building the architecture, but the leverage is difficult. What do you actually do with global input? So one of the big questions we have now, what are the institutions that you can have that can take into account global input? How do you usefully use this information? And how do you change incentive models of the kinds of organizations we were working with before to actually be able to hold and understand global input? I wanted to pause and point out a few things that we've learned. So a lot of these projects were difficult. I think doing participatory AI is difficult, building democratic AI is difficult. And for what it's worth, here is what led us to the global project. First, I think it's very important to work backwards from leverage points. There are many things that we want to change in the world, but we often don't have an input into which to change them. And working backwards from leverage points can be constraining, so your mileage may vary, but you can then choose something that you want to affect in the world, where like we want to retrain Claude, we want to change this particular policy, and if you work backwards to get public input into that, it's a lot more likely it will work. Second, one thing I've realized is there are a lot more people interested in these questions that care deeply about this than we might think. We first started reaching out to partners who were in the AI ecosystem, who were thinking about AI ethics, who were working on data ownership, all of these fantastic things. But actually, a lot of the input we got was from people around the world. I recently got an email from a group called the Grandmothers Collective, which is fantastic, and they're worried about AI, right? Like, they're thinking about what does the future mean for people like me. So many people around the world are thinking about this, and I think our coalitions could get a lot more creative. We're working with a group called AI and Faith, to the religious conversation earlier, right? It's not people who are working on AI anymore that are worried about this. It's really different kinds of people from around the world. That's been really helpful for us to learn. Third, this is a note to self, but there are good reasons we don't do direct democracy. We shouldn't forget them when we try to think about democratic governance. So I think there's always a temptation when we reimagine democracy in some new context to go back to the basics, right? Like, should we have citizens' assemblies or deliberation for everything? Probably we shouldn't. There is a good reason that we don't. That doesn't mean that we don't want to be more democratic than we currently are, but we probably haven't come up with the right ways to do that. And that brings me to 4, which is a controversial one sometimes, but it's actually use the technology. So we try to build a bunch of our experiments on top of new AI systems. We think that this technology, as imperfect as it is, can be useful in this process. And that's partly because we're really trying to solve problems at scale, and we are really not sure there's another way to do it. So these are the kinds of things that take me to what's next for us, which, as I mentioned, is this global dialogues process that we're running with people from around the world. And I pause here because I think that, the word global can be a very abstract concept when we think about it. And it felt that way to me before we started working with people in different places. And it became very clear how different some of our values can be while we agree on many core things. So earlier we were talking about what it looks like to build African values into AI. I think this is a crucial question because people really do differ in the kinds of futures that they want to see, and it is not possible for us to all agree. And at the same time, what we found is there are a couple of precepts on which everyone we've run this process with, which is thousands of people across 70 countries, and we run it every couple of weeks. People do consistently agree, we are worried about centralized control, we want to change this. They don't agree on what they want the alternative to look like. People do agree, I don't want AI to mediate all of my relationships. They don't agree on what they want their relationships to look like. And so the reason to run global processes is to build out plural evaluations, to build out plural data sets, and to create different schemes for the future that actually have infrastructure that is different across different regions. I will end with this, as my time is almost over. It is very difficult to build democratic AI. It's very difficult to build participation into any complex, fast-moving, highly capitalized system. This is a very hard thing to do. The thing that keeps reminding me that it's important is that people do care a lot about this. They are worried, they are optimistic, and they are engaged. Every time we run one of these processes, we get nuanced, interesting feedback that I want to build the world on top of. I think it's easy to forget when we talk about democratization or participation in the abstract, but there are people around the world who will be impacted by these decisions, and they are capable of showing up and being a part of them. And I hope we can all build towards that future. Thank you.
Thank you, Divya Siddarth. We have a few moments for questions, and so we can fit as many questions as possible if you can keep your questions short, but come up to the mic.
Hi, thanks so much for that talk. I have like a two-part question. The first one is, to what extent do you think open source is kind of inherently essential or not for democratizing AI? And any thoughts that you have on that? And then the second question is, as we think about democratizing AI, and of course these conversations about values, there's certain value systems in certain countries that could be at odds with human rights, thinking about gender norms and biases and values in certain countries, right? And so to what extent does democratizing AI also come into conflict with thinking about, in some cases, these, perhaps human right tensions with certain values in certain places, and how do we grapple with that while still maintaining true to this sense of democratization?
Fantastic questions. I'll go fast. So open source, I think there are many ways in which open source is crucial infrastructure for democratization. In particular, like most of our partners around the world use open source models. They can't afford API credits to like Anthropic, right? So I think that is crucial. However, open source isn't enough in the sense that when we ask people the kinds of capabilities that they want to see diffused, there are some things that they're like, people should not have access to that. And so I think open source sometimes trades off with democratic decision making where people don't want certain things to be shared, right? And so it's not always that open source is strictly good, but I think the foundational infrastructure of being able to share not just open source tooling, but as some people here work on, open source safety tooling, like benchmarks should be open sourced, evaluations that labs are running should be open sourced, right? So those kinds of questions I think are really important. On the second, this is a big problem, I think. I mean, fundamentally, are we going to build like global AI that has everyone's values into account? Are we going to go regional? Are we going to go religious? Are we going to go demographic groups? I mean, there are so many different ways that we're probably going to see splits in the AI ecosystem. And certainly some of those groups I can say I won't agree with or be thrilled about. I do think we shouldn't be rebuilding our societal infrastructure from scratch. And so we already have ways that we think about this, right? We already have ways that we try to enforce human rights frameworks. We already have ways that we try to think about country level sovereignty versus global sovereignty versus cross-border sovereignty. And so I would like to see some of those frameworks be extended to AI. And I also think if you this is a pill that I am happy to swallow, but your mileage may vary. If you truly believe in pluralism, it is the case that we will be seeing tools and models that have values that we don't agree with. And I think within the bounds of, what we have all agreed are human rights frameworks or other kinds of international frameworks, it is important to preserve that because that's where cultural pluralism comes from.
Hey,
Margaret?
Divya. As you know, Margaret Levy from Stanford. I'm a great fan of this work, and what I really want to know is always more about it. But let me focus on one piece of it, which is the working backwards. I think what you mean by that is you're getting to voices that aren't always heard, starting from there and coming up. Is that what you mean by working backwards?
No.
Okay.
What I meant in that context was start from the thing you want to change.
Okay.
And it is often true, so one of the reasons we're running the global dialogues is to make sure people are involved in agenda setting, right? So you don't just get to pick the thing you want to change usually. But I think it is important to work backwards from, I want to change the data ecosystem in this way. I want people to have ownership. I want compute for the global south. I want, whatever it is. And to make sure you have a path to changing that, only because I often see conversations about participation or democratization be quite general about people directing the future, as opposed to saying, here's the ecosystem we have, and here's the place I can change it.
So I want to make one other point, which is about a possible framing here. One of the key features of democracy, as it's been theorized, is that there is, in some sense, equal consideration of the various voices that exist in whatever one defines as the polity. And equal consideration can mean many different things institutionally. So I'd love to see some institutions built that aren't, I agree with you, about the kinds of mechanisms that we have lots of things that are already there. But we really need to figure out what it means to have interests represented and all the interests represented, and have a mechanism for doing that. So again, any way you can elaborate what you've learned from the incredible work that you've done about some ways to build that out, as opposed to running to sortition or some other mechanism that's trendy today.
Yeah, I mean, let's do it. I think some of the most interesting work here is actually around data ownership and different ways to do data intermediary mechanisms, which can translate into slices of ownership over the eventual model. As you know, there's some interesting work there. I think the second piece, going back to the open source question, is various mechanisms to open source different parts of the pipeline and what it means to have people do that. But we should talk about it.
I realize we're just about at time, but we have a very patient person over there at the microphone, so please.
Thanks, Divya. And Divya, as you know, I love this work. I love it even more. And you also know that one of the criticisms of this type of deliberative work is that, especially in a sort of political theory sense, it might subvert or circumvent big D democracy, representative democracy, and those things might be in tension. And a month ago, I might have responded, and you might have responded, yeah, whatever. We're now in a phase in which big D democracy, especially in the United States, is being torn apart, and AI leaders are either implicated in or relaxed about that process. I wonder how you have rethought the relationship between deliberative democracy and top-down regulation, institutions, all of that good stuff.
Yeah, I guess we've had this conversation. I don't find these things as in tension as I think you might, in the sense that, one, I think often the questions that representative democracy is thinking about in this space end up being fairly different from the kinds of questions. I wouldn't call this deliberative necessarily, but it's definitely like a large public input process that feeds into things like, we don't do policy as much, but model architecture, decision-making over deployment, and things like that. Fundamentally, I think even these processes should be more representative. So to the point of, there's a reason we don't use direct democracy for most things. I think it is the case that we should come up with much more representative mechanisms to do most kinds of governance, and those representative mechanisms should work a lot better than the ones we currently have. So that, I guess, is one thing that has been brewing for me over the past few months. I think the second piece around, to me, it makes this work even more important. So in the US, a place that I'm unfortunately very familiar with in terms of its current AI politics, is that I think there's a massive trust issue in institutions that has led to a lot of the erosion of representative democracy. And I think what we see from people who have participated in many of these processes is that it actually makes them more likely to participate in institutional democratic processes and to have higher trust in institutions in general. Overall, I wouldn't personally say the problem with the US is like too much successful democratic mechanisms, right? Like I basically think that if you can run useful public input processes that make people feel heard into any large-scale powerful decision, that's good for other types of representative or democratic policies as well. It's good for institutionalism. It's like generally good for social fabric. And so to me, these things are really not in tension. But I'd love to hear more of your thoughts.
I think that's an excellent way to end the first day of our IASEAI 25. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.